requires ginning up scenarios that are not in evidence.
Was the God of Israel, Yahweh, defeated in battle by the Moabite god Chemosh? I don't think so, and I've been having a bit of a back and forth with Dan McClellan about whether 2 Kings 3 shows Yahweh getting defeated by Chemosh. This video right here is in response to his most recent video, number 1759, in which he critiques me. For the sake of time in this video, I'm just going to summarize Dan's arguments instead of playing clips so this doesn't run on too long, though I encourage you all to go watch his video to make sure that I am accurately representing him. So at the start of the video, Dan is defending himself about my comments that he makes, that it seems like he is suggesting a defeat of Israel is also a defeat of Yahweh. And I have already stated that if Dan agrees that the defeat of one does not entail the defeat of the other, I feel no need to belabor this point, so I'm not going to dedicate much time here to that. Next, Dan attacks my position that Moab had been delivered into the hand of the Israelites at the point in which the Moabite king made the sacrifice. Now, in my previous video, I referenced verses which indicated that to be delivered into the hand of meant control over, and one of these verses that I cited was when David came upon Saul while he was sleeping, and Saul is described as having been delivered into the hand of David. Dan attacks my use of this verse because he says there's a discontinuity. In the case of David, he had complete control over Saul, and it's through the choice of David that Saul got away. Whereas with 2 Kings 3, this was not the case. Dan says that the Israelites simply did not have this type of power and control over the Moabites, and I think Dan is simply mistaken on this. The narrative displays the helplessness of the king of Moab in this situation, and the sacrifice seems to be an indicator that he realized this as well. My position is that prior to making that sacrifice, the Moabite king was completely vanquished. He knew it, Israelites knew it, it had been delivered into their hands. However, upon making that sacrifice, Yahweh came against the people of Israel and drove them back. The fact that Yahweh intervenes at that point does not mean that Moab was not in Israel's hand prior to them making that sacrifice, any more than the fact that David let Saul go indicates that Saul was never actually in his hand. We will talk more about this sacrifice momentarily. Next, Dan defends his introduction of Chemosh into the story, despite the fact that Chemosh is not explicitly mentioned. Dan's chain of reasoning is that in battle, people sometimes make sacrifices in order to appeal to their gods to help them. Dan says we should therefore interpret this sacrifice as being targeted at Chemosh, and since this target is what immediately precedes the statement of wrath, we should therefore interpret this wrath as coming from Chemosh. The problem with this is that Dan is looking for parallel accounts in the ancient world broadly and ignoring evidence from within the Hebrew Bible that suggests that this was not directed at Chemosh as a means of catalyzing him, as the best context for the Moabites' actions is in the culture that was closer to them, which would be Israel. It's a burnt offering, which has the role of showing contrition of the offerer. The king of Moab's rebellion has failed, and he is now seeking atonement so as not to be killed. Burnt offerings was something you do when the battle is over, either because you are celebrating victory or mourning your defeat. The idea of a defeated rebelling vassal making an offering of propitiation to the one they have rebelled against is something we see in 2 Kings 18. Additionally, in 2 Kings 26, after Ahaz establishes an alliance with the Neo-Assyrian king, Ahaz sends a priest to offer a burnt offering before the king of Assyria. So burnt offerings were used to express contrition and apology by battle losers and to vassal kings to solidify relationships. Either one can make sense in the context of 2 Kings. The idea of a son which dies as a substitute for the sins of the father is also a theme that arises both in the Hebrew Bible and in ancient culture more broadly. So this may be the death of the son being substituted for the death of the defeated Moabite king. So when we look at this practice through the lens of the Southern Levant specifically, we have a variety of potential reasons for why this sacrifice might have been made that isn't simply, I want my God to save me, so I'll sacrifice my son to him. Not only are the interpretations I've offered better because it focuses on the culture that is more likely to relate to the Moabites, it also makes better sense of all the problems of Dan's view that I have already mentioned, such as the fact that it's extremely odd for the Israelites to attribute this type of power to a pagan deity and for them to leave this in the text. This still leaves open why the wrath came upon Israel. Is it because of the Israelites participating in the sacrifice in a way that was inappropriate? Is it because of other factors that I have mentioned, such as violations of warfare rules? We can speculate, as the text doesn't make it clear, despite Dan's insistence that it does. There is zero reason for us to think that this is a sacrifice that is aimed directly at getting Kamash to come in and wage war on the king's behalf. Next, Dan continues to deny that the warfare engaged in would be a violation of what is described in Deuteronomy 20. And again, numerous commentators make this exact same point. This is not just me, including commentators that Dan has cited against me in his own responses to me. So next, I pointed out that Dan was mistaken to think that verse 15 of Deuteronomy was some dividing line between how to deal with foreign cities and how to deal with those in Canaan. He set those aside because it's technical and matter of judgment. That's fine. I'm not going to beef with you on that. I also noted that the felling of the food trees was not for the reason Dan offered, which was that they needed to eat those later. Dan hops straight to attacking the reason for the fruit trees not being allowed to be cut down. And his argument is, hey, look, verse 20 says that if it doesn't produce fruit, you can chop it down to produce siege works. However, Dan is ignoring the fact that that remark is directly in the context of when you are engaged in a long siege of a city. This is a specific criteria for how to behave when besieging a city. So the allowance is made to chop down trees in order to build the weapons for the siege. It is worth noting that if there is a long siege of the city, destroying the lifelines for that city by destroying their food source might be a tempting strategy, especially if you know that you can get food elsewhere, whereas your opponents can't. Dan asserts that my view is wrong because the text says that the reason for not chopping down the fruit trees is because you can eat them. Couple issues here. First, it can be translated that way, or it can be understood as an allowance of permission. Don't chop down the trees, but you can eat from them. I really doubt the Israelites needed to be told, hey, you know you can eat from fruit trees, right? Second, the statement about a tree not being human, that you should besiege it, in my view, does not necessitate that no tree is ever allowed to be chopped down. Rather, my view offers the rationale that Yahweh is condemning certain types of scorched earth tactics, but making an allowance for the construction of siege weapons when you are engaged in a long siege of the city. This is completely reasonable. Next, Dan remarks that Deuteronomy 20, under his view, was not even written at the times of 2 Kings 3. This gets into debates about the dating of the Torah and 2 Kings, which I don't think it's worth getting into here, because even if I grant this, even if the text is not written down in Deuteronomy at the point of 2 Kings, the section about warfare can represent a tradition that is in the culture at the time of the writing or the events in 2 Kings 3, which does cohere with the timeline that the Hebrew Bible itself offers. Now, Dan makes some comments about why it's not rational to suggest that the author of 2 Kings is cueing the audience to think that the wrath came because of warfare, this type of, violation of warfare, but I don't think the author is cueing the audience for this. I've never claimed that I think the author is cueing the audience and is just trying to hint at them and get them to, make this connection. I really doubt that's what the author is doing. I merely said that this might be a reason that the wrath came upon them if the wrath is coming from Yahweh. But I recognize that there are other potential reasons that this wrath might have come upon them. And I was open about some of the potential issues with my views. I don't need to show for sure that this is directly what the author had in mind here. I am merely pointing out that this view that Dan is presenting, one, has a lot of problems, which a lot of commentators have pointed out to him, and that there are alternative explanations which I think do a better job of accounting for these problems. Now, are there weird things or oddities about those explanations? Yes, and they vary. Like I said, I think that the view that Drew Holland puts forward in his work, which I've drawn from in this response, I think that's a better explanation probably than the violation of warfare view. But I don't think the violation of the warfare view that I've articulated, I think it has merit. I think it has bite, and I think that should be on the table when we talk about this. And so Dan has not defeated that view. He has not defended at any point. He has not defended his view from the numerous issues that it has that I've mentioned and that other commentators have mentioned. So I am sure that Dan at some point will make a response to this video, including the last one I made. So I guess I'll see you then.